The bass from the music thumped through the walls, muffled but insistent, as I leaned against the bathroom sink, my head spinning just enough to make the room tilt. The party was in full swing outside, but here, in this small, dimly lit space, it felt like another world entirely. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and something sweet, vanilla, maybe, from the candles flickering on the counter. My reflection in the mirror looked different tonight, like the edges of me had blurred, softened by the liquor and the heat of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and I turned to see him there, my husband's best friend, Jared. His tie was loose, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his dark eyes held a glint that made my stomach tighten in a way I wasn't ready to admit. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, rough around the edges like he'd been drinking too. It wasn't a casual question. His gaze lingered on me, and I felt it like a touch, skimming over my skin. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. "Just needed a minute," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Too soft. Too intimate. He stepped closer, and I felt the heat of him before he even touched me. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his hand brushing against mine on the sink. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything was on my mind. The way he'd looked at me across the room earlier like he was seeing me for the first time. The way my husband had laughed too loudly, oblivious to the tension simmering between us. The way I couldn't stop thinking about what it would feel like if Jared's hands were on me for real, not just this accidental brush of skin against skin. "I don't know," I whispered, and it was the truth. I didn't know. I didn't know why I was here, why I hadn't walked out the second he followed me in. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, and then his hand was on my waist, pulling me closer. I froze for a second, my breath catching in my throat, and then I leaned into him, letting my body press against his. His chest was solid and warm, and the scent of him, clean sweat and whiskey, made my head swim. "You've always been beautiful," he murmured, his lips close to my ear. "But tonight you're something else." I shivered, my hand sliding up his chest without my permission. "Jared." "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice rough, his fingers digging into my hips. "Tell me to walk out that door, and I will." I opened my mouth to say the words, but they didn't come. Instead, I rose up on my toes, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was barely there, a question more than anything. He answered it immediately, his mouth crashing down on mine, hungry, desperate, like he'd been waiting for this as long as I had. His hands were everywhere, pulling at my dress, sliding up my thighs, and I let him, my own fingers fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. The fabric fell away, and I ran my hands over his chest, feeling the muscle beneath his skin, the heat of him. He groaned against my mouth, his hands slipping under my dress, his fingers finding the edge of my lingerie. "God, you're soft," he muttered, his breath hot against my neck as he kissed his way down to my collarbone. My head fell back, my hands gripping his shoulders as he hooked his fingers in the waistband of my lingerie and pulled them down. The cool air hit my skin, and then his hand was between my legs, his fingers sliding through me, teasing, coaxing. "Jared," I gasped, my hips rocking against his hand as he found the spot that made me tremble. His thumb circled there, slow and deliberate, and I bit my lip to keep from crying out. "You're so wet," he murmured, his lips brushing against mine. "Do you know how much I've wanted this? How much I've thought about you, about this?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. His fingers were inside me now, moving in a rhythm that had me clutching at him, my nails digging into his skin. He kissed me again, deep and demanding, and I moaned into his mouth, my body arching against his. "Turn around," he said, his voice thick with need, and I didn't hesitate, didn't think. I turned, bracing myself against the sink, my dress pushed up around my waist. His hands slid up my thighs, spreading me open, and then his mouth was there, hot and wet, and I cried out, my fingers tightening on the edge of the sink. "So sweet," he muttered against my skin, his tongue circling me, teasing me until I was trembling, my hips rocking back against his face. He didn't stop, didn't let up, and I felt myself unraveling, the pleasure building, coiling tight in my stomach. "Jared, please," I begged, my voice shaking. He didn't make me wait. His fingers were back, pressing inside me as his tongue worked me over, and I came apart, my body shaking, my cries muffled by the music pounding through the walls. He didn't give me time to recover. His hands were on my hips, pulling me back, and I felt him, hard, desperate, pressing against me. I tensed for a second, the reality of what we were about to do hitting me, but then he leaned over me, his lips brushing against my ear. "Tell me to stop," he whispered again, his voice strained. I didn't. Instead, I reached back, guiding him to me, and he pushed in, slow, careful, but it still hurt, a sharp, stinging pain that made me gasp. "Shit," he muttered, his hands gripping my hips. "You okay?" I nodded, biting my lip. "Just go slow." He did, inching in, giving me time to adjust, but even then, the pain was there, sharp and unrelenting. And yet, there was something else, something deeper, a pleasure that was already starting to build, mingling with the hurt. "You feel so good," he groaned, his hands moving up to my waist, his thumbs pressing into the small of my back. He started to move then, slow at first, but soon the rhythm built, his hips slamming into me, his breath hot against my neck. The pain was still there, but it was fading, replaced by something else, something hot and urgent that had me pushing back against him, matching his pace. My hands slid up the mirror, my fingers leaving streaks in the condensation as I gripped the edge of the sink, my body moving with his. "Damn, you're tight," he muttered, his hands squeezing my hips as he thrust into me, harder, faster. "Absolutely perfect." I turned my head, catching his gaze in the mirror, and the look in his eyes, hungry, possessive, desperate, made my stomach flip. He reached between my legs, his fingers finding me again, and I cried out, my body arching back against his. "Come for me," he growled, his lips brushing against my ear. "Let go." And I did, my body trembling as the pleasure washed over me, wave after wave, until I was shuddering, gasping, my nails digging into the sink. He followed me over the edge, his hands tightening on my hips as he buried himself deep inside me, his groan muffled against my neck. For a moment, we stayed like that, connected, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the bathroom. Then he pulled away, and I turned to face him, my body still trembling, my mind spinning. "Jared," I started, but he shook his head, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "Don't," he said softly. "Just, don't." The party continued to hum outside the bathroom door, muffled laughter and the clinking of glasses blending into a distant haze. My heart pounded as Jared's hands lingered on my waist, his breath hot against my ear. I could still feel the lingering ache from earlier, but it was tinged with something else now, something electric, undeniable. Our eyes met in the dim light, and I saw the same hunger mirrored in his gaze. "We shouldn't," I whispered, even as my body leaned into his. "Then why are you still here?" he murmured back, his voice low and teasing. His fingers traced the curve of my hip, sending shivers up my spine. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. My husband was out there, mingling with guests, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. But the thought only made my pulse quicken, the forbidden nature of it all pulling me deeper. Jared's lips brushed against my neck, and I shuddered, my resolve crumbling. "Not here," I said, my voice barely audible. "Someone could." He cut me off with a kiss, his mouth claiming mine with a hunger that left me breathless. When he pulled back, his eyes gleamed with mischief. The guest bedroom. Down the hall. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding, my hand slipping into his as he led me out of the bathroom. We moved quickly, blending into the shadows of the hallway, our footsteps silent against the carpet. My heart pounded with every step, the thrill of secrecy making my skin prickle. The guest bedroom was small, lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Jared closed the door behind us, the click of the lock sending a jolt of anticipation through me. He turned to face me, his eyes dark with desire, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough as he stepped closer. His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. "You know that, right?" I didn't respond, too caught up in the heat of his touch. His lips found mine again, softer this time, but no less intense. I melted into him, my hands roaming over his chest, feeling the hard muscles beneath his shirt. He groaned, pulling me closer, his body pressing against mine. His hands moved to the hem of my dress, lifting it slowly, his fingers brushing against my skin. I shivered as the cool air hit my thighs, the anticipation making my stomach flutter. He knelt in front of me, his hands sliding up my legs, and I gasped as his lips found the sensitive skin of my inner thigh. "Jared," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes smoldering. "Tell me to stop." I didn't. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer, and I cried out as his mouth found me, his tongue hot and insistent. My hands tangled in his hair, my body arching into him as pleasure surged through me. He was relentless, his movements driving me to the edge, and I could feel myself unraveling, the tension coiling tighter and tighter. When I finally came undone, my knees buckled, and he caught me, his arms wrapping around me as I trembled. He kissed me deeply, the taste of me on his lips, and I moaned into his mouth, my body still pulsing with aftershocks. "Your turn," I murmured, my hands moving to his belt. His breath hitched as I unbuckled it, my fingers fumbling with the button of his jeans. I could feel the heat of him through the fabric, and my stomach clenched with desire. He let out a low growl as I freed him, his hands gripping my shoulders as I sank to my knees. I looked up at him, my lips brushing against the tip, and he shuddered, his eyes closing as I took him in my mouth. "Damn," he groaned, his hands tangling in my hair as I moved, my tongue swirling around him. He was thick, filling my mouth, and I reveled in the power I had over him, the way his body responded to my every touch. His hips began to move, thrusting gently into my mouth, and I moaned around him, the vibrations making him groan. "You're incredible," he breathed, his voice strained. I could feel him getting closer, his movements becoming more erratic, and I devoured harder, desperate to make him fall apart. When he finally came, his entire body tensed, and I swallowed every drop, my own desire flaring at the taste of him. He pulled me to my feet, his hands gripping my waist as he kissed me deeply, his body still trembling. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured against my lips. I smiled, my hand sliding up his chest. "Not yet." He groaned, his lips trailing down my neck as he lifted me, carrying me to the bed. I laughed softly, the sound cut off as he laid me down, his body covering mine. His hands moved to my thighs, spreading them wide, and I gasped as he positioned himself at my entrance. "Tell me you want this," he said, his voice rough with need. "I want this," I breathed, my hands gripping his shoulders. He pushed into me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and I moaned, my body stretching to accommodate him. It was different this time, the pain replaced by a deep, aching pleasure that made my head spin. He began to move, his thrusts slow and deliberate, and I arched into him, my nails digging into his back. "You feel so incredibly good," he groaned, his lips brushing against mine. I couldn't respond, too lost in the sensations to form words. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer, and I cried out as he thrust into me, deeper, harder, until I felt myself shatter, my body convulsing around him. He groaned, his own release crashing over him, and for a moment, we were lost in each other, the world outside forgotten. When he finally pulled away, I could still feel the echoes of him inside me, my body trembling with the aftershocks. He kissed me softly, his hands brushing the hair from my face. "We should go back," he murmured, his voice tinged with regret. I nodded, my heart sinking at the thought. But as we dressed in silence, I couldn't help the smile that tugged at my lips. This wasn't over. Not yet,